Okay, we are going to get started now with our sources. So the first source we're going to see is in Shmo Perek Yubet Pasuk Chet, where it says, "Va'achlu et habasar balayla hazeh tzli eish umatzot al merorim yochluhu." So they ate the meat that night. We're talking about the meat of the sacrifice. They roasted it on a fire, and they ate it matzot al merorim yochluhu. We're going to see this pasuk translated in a few different ways throughout the evening. The simple reading sounds like, and maybe because we're influenced by Hillel, we read it in this way, which is that you eat the meat that night with matzah and maror together. Yochluhu means you will eat it. Okay, we're going to darshan this it later on also, because it sounds like it should say yochalotam or yochlu, should eat, but it says specifically it, which sounds a little bit singular. So we're going to have to get back to this. So the idea sounds like, at least the simple reading is that you would eat the following three things together, but it's not clear whether they actually all have to be eaten that night or they actually need to be eaten together. Now, if you look at the commentary of the Bechor Shur, so he explains that we have to eat these, tochlu matzot ima pesach al merorim. Okay, you eat the matzah with the pesach and the maror. Again, going back to Rabban Gamliel's three big things that everyone needs to know about, the pesach, the matzah, and the maror. You eat them together, and he has a very beautiful description as to why. He says we take the bitter herbs, which signify the avdut, the slavery. We mix it with the cherut, which is the matzah, because that was when they got out and they had to rush because they were getting saved. They were getting their freedom. And then the Pesach, which symbolizes how they were saved, because the blood here, it says, "Ha-Pesach siman lahatzalah," the saving, the salvation, sheitzilam b'shat hamagefa, because they were saved when God, right, passed over their houses, and the Pesach is a memory of that. So here you have the three concepts, and I think that this, why did I choose this source? Because it's a very beautiful source, and it really discusses what's going on Seder night, and I think it really relates a lot to what we saw at the end of the last class about all these actions we do. And the whole idea of the Seder, as the Rambam says, we want to see ourselves as if we got out of Egypt. Now, how can we see ourselves as if we got out of Egypt? If we just discussed how they got out, we wouldn't understand the whole process they went through, right? They went through a whole process. In order to understand what freedom is about, you have to feel, what does it mean to be enslaved? And therefore, in this night, we mix all these things together. We have a mix, a combination of things that symbolize, and that's why all night, right, we waver between reclining and not reclining. There's certain things you do recline for. There's certain things you don't recline for, right? And we've discussed this before. There's a combination of all sorts of events that are happening, and it's all in order to have this experience and be able to understand what happened then and what they went through when they got out of Egypt. So that's the concept, at least if we're going to talk about the concept. Right now we're starting with conceptual, and then we're going to get into details because that's what the Gemara likes to do. The concept of eating them all at the same time is to kind of experience. Now, it's funny because they didn't experience all these things at the same time, right? The idea here is we have to experience them all together so that we understand all the different components that went into understanding the story of getting out of Egypt. Okay, now before we start, I wanted to go through the section since I gave you a section to put the punctuation in. So I wanted you to see here, I see, by the way, that there's a minor mistake, which is that I gave you a section to punctuate in the next section, but I see I accidentally gave you the entire section here and not just the first section. So in the second Chavruta section, you can skip the punctuation because you already did it here, okay? So I wanted to pick out keywords from this section that would give you clues as to where to put punctuation, because that's really what we're working on, is how to learn how to punctuate. So it starts with Amar Ravina. So we know that Ravina is saying something, right? He says Amar le Rav Masharshia, and then he says Amar Hachi Amar Hillel. So he's quoting something in the name of Hillel. And then the next thing you get, which is an indication that we're moving on to something else, says Mishum, right? The word Mishum is on account of. So we already know he said something, and then they're going to say it's Mishum, which is coming to explain that. So that's the first word to note. Okay, that's this Mishum word over here. Then if we continue, it says Va'afilu. The next word that gives you a clue that we're getting to something new is afilu, even. That usually starts a new section, which is even Lemanda Amal. Again, we'll get into the description later. Hane Mile. Hanemile usually, not always, but usually it limits and says, well, this is only. So again, it's usually going to start a new section. Again, when I say section, I mean more like a new phrase, right? We started with somebody says something. Then he says mishum, which is an explanation. Then we have afilu, even something, which we don't yet know what everything is, but even. Then they're going to say hanemile, that's only in this particular case. Aval, okay, our next word is aval, but, however, okay, then we're going to have, okay, that takes you to the next part. Then man is usually a question. Who? So man Tana, who's the Tana? Okay, and then we're going to ask a question, and then we get an answer. If you know the question's who, then as soon as we see a name like Hillel, then we know, oh, that's providing an answer. Okay, then we have a Ditanya, which is usually a proof or a question. So we don't know here what it is, but likely since it's saying Hillel, it's Hillel, and then Ditanya as it says, and then we have a quote with Hillel in it. Okay, so that's a good way to start learning how to punctuate by pointing out all those key words. Okay, I'll already give you the next section since it's here. It was my mistake. I accidentally meant to cut it off from here. But in any case, you have the next section, which then starts with Amar Rabbi Yochanan. So that already is going to be something new. Ditanya is going to be, again, either something that goes against what he says or a proof for what he says. And then we have a Braita. So again, the Braita is going to be all in Hebrew. So Yachol, Yehei, Korchan, right? We see that's all Hebrew. And then the Hebrew is going to end after the word Yochluhu. I'm sorry, after the word Zebifnei Atzmo v'Zebifnei Atzmo. Okay, that's the end of the Hebrew. Now we have a matkifla. If you remember, we had matkifla last time. Matkifla means someone is on the attack, right? He goes and he says, wait, that doesn't make any sense. And here comes his question. And then we're going to say Ella. Okay, usually someone asks a question and then they say, well, then I'm going to say Ella Amarav Ashi. The same person who asked the question is now going to provide his own answer. Okay. And then we have a hachi katane. If you remember, we learned that last time. I think it was last week. Hachi katane means read it this way. This is the way the source should read because obviously he had some issue with the way it appeared before. And then again, he quotes, okay, he's quoting this Yachol lo Yehei. This is a Braita. Actually, usually it's, right, he's just rereading the Braita that we read before in different words. And then it's going to end again where the last Braita ended, which is Zebifnei Atzmo. Here we switch into Aramaic, because if you remember, all the Braitos are in Hebrew. Now we get to Aramaic. So now this seems to be another line at the end of the sugya, and that takes us to the end. Okay, so that's just a few tips about, since this is a skills-based class, we want some tips about how to learn how to punctuate. Okay, now let's go into the Gemara. Amar Ravina, Amarli Rav Misharshia, Bered Rav Natan. So Ravina says, I was told by Rav Misharshia, many things in the Gemara are always passed down from person to person. So I was told by Rav Misharshia, the son of Rabbi Natan, Hachi Amar Hillel Mishmei de Gemara. Now it's very confusing, the sugya, and I wrote to you, hopefully you all read it. This is not the same Hillel mentioned later. There's two Hillels, it's very confusing. There's Hillel, who's the very famous Hillel of Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai, who lived in the time of the temple, and he's the one mentioned at the end of the, later on in our Gemara today, in the end of this section. And he's the one that we do Zecher Lemikdash Kehillel, as Hillel did in the temple. This is Hillel who wasn't living in the time of the temple. He's an Amora from Eretz Israel, from Israel, and he lives in the first generation of the Amoraim. So he says, Hachi Amar Hillel Mishmei de Gemara. This is what Hillel told me in the name of tradition. Okay, he had a tradition about this Gemara, and the Gemara does not mean Gemara. Gemara means tradition. Lo nikroch inish matza umaror bahade adade, and that's why it's very confusing if you thought it was the same Hillel, because he says don't put matzah and maror together. The famous Hillel is the one who made the sandwich, but here he says don't put the matzah and maror together, v'nechol, and eat it like that. Why? Mishum desvir alam, because he held matzah bizman hazeh deoraita umaror de Rabbanan. This becomes a very strange sentence. First thing we have to know is what I told you before, which is matzah nowadays is deoraita, is by Torah law. Maror is derabbanan, so that's a given. But what's the thing that's a little bit strange here? Ate maror derabbanan umevatale la matzah deoraita. So comes our derabbanan obligation, and it nullifies the matzah of deoraita. So nowadays, basically, he's saying, okay, he's not talking about the time of the temple. We'll get to that later. But what he's saying is nowadays, which is in their time, it was, soon after the destruction, we're talking now many years later, doesn't make a difference. The point is, since Maror is Rabbanan by rabbinic and Matza is Deoraita, the Maror nullifies the Matza. Now, if you would have asked me, I would have thought it would be the opposite. You would think a Torah obligation is more significant, and it kind of, what does it mean to nullify? So it sounds like it kind of overpowers, right? You would think a Torah obligation would overpower the rabbinic obligation, but that's not what he says. He says it's the opposite. Now we have to understand what is going on here about something nullifying another mitzvah, and what's this all about? So we're going to learn in the Sugiyot, there's a concept of our mitzvot mivatlin zo et zo. Can mitzvot come along and nullify other mitzvot? Meaning, can you do two things together, or will one nullify the other? So first, let's go back and understand a little bit about what the possible reasons are why Maror would nullify the matzah. Number one, why does nullification work in general? And number two, why is it that the Maror nullifies the matzah and not the reverse? So Rashi says this, and then the question becomes, what's this concept of mitzvot nullifying another mitzvah? Is it all mitzvot? Is it certain particular mitzvot? And for this, I'm going to bring you 4 different interpretations. I hope you saw some of them in Chavruta. Rashi starts off and says, it's the mevatel le'leta'am matzah de'oraita. He says this has to do with taste. And if you know about Jewish law in the kitchen, right, there's what we always call batel b'shishim, that if you have 60 times the amount, you drop your milk into a pot of cholent, right? What's the situation? So we say that the flavor, if there's much, much more of this is shishim, if there's 60 times, they assess that that's about the amount, that if there's 60 times the amount of one thing more than the other, then we're going to take these 2 things, it's milk and meat, they're 2 different things, and one basically nullifies the other because there's way more taste of one than the other. So according to Rashi, this is a basic law, and this goes to kind of, you could call it reality, you could call it a connect, right? In other words, are you going to taste the matzah? If there's so much maror, you're not going to, now there's not 60 times the amount of maror, so it's a little bit tricky here. But we'll see later, if you saw the later source in the Maram Chalava, I'm just skipping to source number 4 here. He says, Yesh mefarshim de'af al gav dimin v'she'eno mino. Now he brings the regular laws, and I'm not going to get into all the details of what this basically means. 2 different types, like milk and meat. So, right, if you have 2 pieces of meat, one doesn't cancel out the flavor of the other because it just adds flavor. It's all the same flavor. But if you have 2 different types, then one's going to basically nullify the other. The yav tama, normally it will give, if you have 2 different, then they each give taste. The tama lo batal. Now, if you have 2 and they both have strong taste, then they're going to both give taste because let's say you have a lot of milk and you have a lot of meat. So you're going to taste the milk and you're going to taste the meat. If you have meat and meat, you're not going to necessarily taste one over the other. So normally we'd say maybe it's not nullified, but afilu hachi, he adds kevan de tama de maror nafish. Since the flavor of maror, we all know bitter herbs are very strong flavor. So he basically says this all has to do with taste, and it's because the maror is so strong that it's going to overpower the matzah. Now, this is true if you're using, we've talked about that there's lettuce people use and real horseradish, right? Horseradish is really strong. Lettuce, I don't know as much. But basically, that opinion in the Maram Chalava and Rashi view this as a food issue. So first of all the topic then of mitzvot, nullifying other mitzvot, seems to be a law of nullification in general of foods and tastes and flavors, and whether you taste it or you don't taste it. And that's why the maror is going to come and basically overpower the matzah in terms of its flavor. And that's going to cause it to basically, the matzah, you won't be yotze your mitzvah, you won't fulfill your obligation of matzah if you eat these 2 together. But comes Rabbeinu David and a bunch of others. I tried to quote you a few people here, but there's basically 2 big schools of thought here. And he says, Eina kavana bibitul ta'am mamash. It's not that we're nullifying flavor. Ela she'achilat matzah shehi mitzvah aleinu, hi b'teila mimenu k'she'ochlaim davar shel reshut. It weakens the significance of a mitzvah when you put it together with something that's not obligatory. Now, the assumption is that if something's rabbinic, okay, which we're going to get to the whole thing, right? That's what we said. Ate, right, the Rabbanan, and mevatel, the deoraita. The rabbinic overrides now why is that? Because you have a mitzvah and the mitzvah is supposed to stand alone. And if you put it together with something that's optional, then that's gonna, now you might think the mitzvah is more important, so it wouldn't be overridden, but no, it weakens the mitzvah because it's all of a sudden put with something that's reshut. It's like if you're trying to think of an example, but if you're dressed nicely and you go to this event and then everyone else is not dressed nicely, well, it weakens your having dressed up. I don't know if that's the best example, but the idea being that when it comes together with something that doesn't belong with it, it kind of it lowers its significance, weakens it. The Meiri says similarly, but in a bit of a different wording. And he says here, in Yam Bitul Mitzvazo, it's though he says the same thing. Lav Bitul Tam, they clearly all saw the same sources, right? They saw the other approach, that it was all about taste. No, that's not the issue. We have matzah, we have maror. You can taste them both. Ela shechivuv mitzvah matzrich. If you're really going to love mitzvot, right, or the beloved nature of a mitzvah, causes it shelo la'arev tam acherimo. This is a bit of a different approach. It's similar to Rabbeinu David, but he says, each mitzvah needs its own stage. It needs its own spotlight. And therefore, if it's the same level of mitzvah, we're good. Or it's even more than it. But if it's weaker than it, okay, it's a problem. Now, the one thing he points out, because you might have asked this question, which is, well, how do we add charoset to maror then? Charoset is, now there's different opinions about whether charoset's a mitzvah or whether it's optional. We didn't get to learn that sugya, but there's a whole debate about it. But even if you say it's a mitzvah, it's clearly not a mitzvah of the Torah. And the maror at least was mentioned in the Torah. So how could you say that? So they say, that's different. That's something that normally goes together. Right? When was the last time you made a lettuce sandwich, right? Just lettuce on matzah. Now, that's not something people normally eat together. But when you have charoset with the maror, or you dip it, right? Any dip, you dip something into something else, that's its normal way of eating. That's not considered that it nullifies it. But when it's something that normally doesn't go together, and you put these two mitzvot together, and one is optional and one is obligatory, those two things can't go together. Okay, so those are the different approaches as to why we would say mitzvot mevatzlot zotzos. So again, we have, is it a food thing? Is it taste? Is it one overpowers the other? And maybe maror will overpower matzah because maror is much stronger. And then it's a food related issue. And then also this concept will only apply to foods. Or does this concept apply to mitzvot in general because of the significance of a mitzvah? A mitzvah needs to have its own special spotlight. And if you weaken it by something else, that's going to make it lose its strength. So now we'll move on to the next section of the Gemara. And while I'm reading, if you want to check your answers and the fill in the blanks, you can see I filled it in here to show you the answers. Now, it could be you could have fit some other words and it would make sense also, but this is how I filled it in. Afilu lemanda amal. Now the Gemara comes up. Now Ravina is continuing, and he says, "Listen. By the way, so the first thing we saw was Hillel. Hillel says, and again, Hillel the Amora, not the Tana. Hillel says that. Let's just go back for a quick minute. Hillel says, according to Ravina, don't put your matzah and maror together nowadays because you will cause the maror to nullify the matzah. So comes the Ravina, and he continues, and he says, Afilu lemanda amar mitzvot ein mevatzlot zotzos. This is a very loaded sentence, and we're going to deal with it a lot in the second part of today's shir, which is, even if you're the one who says that mitzvot don't nullify each other. Now already, what does that tell you? It's like a ding, 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 ding. If there's someone who says, it means there's someone who says something different. Sounds like there's someone who says that the mitzvot do nullify each other. But now he says, even if you think that mitzvot don't nullify each other, which we just explained that they do, but now he said, maybe someone holds you don't, but the person who holds that they don't, hanimile, that's only deoraita b'deoraita. If you have two things on the same level, o dirabanan b'dirabanan, then they won't nullify each other according to the one who thinks they don't. Aval deoraita b'dirabanan, but if you have two different ones, like we just explained, and we just explained all the reasons for it, ate dirabanan u'mevatale l'deoraita. Okay, so again, if you look at the fill in the blanks, this is the bottom line of what he says. If you hold that mitzvot don't nullify each other, that's only rabbinic and rabbinic or Torah and Torah. But if one was rabbinic and one was Torah, or one, right, then the rabbinic one will nullify the Torah one. And therefore, in the situation that we just discussed, which is putting your matzah together with your maror, the korech sandwich, we cannot do it nowadays, according to him, because the maror will nullify the matzah. But if you hold that mitzvot do nullify each other, then even a Torah obligation would nullify a Torah obligation. And what conclusion are you going to come to then? According to the one who holds that mitzvot nullify each other, would you eat your matzah and maror together and even in the time of the temple? You would not. Okay? And that opinion would have to, if that opinion really does exist, which we're going to have a whole debate about whether it really does exist, if that opinion really exists, then the simple reading of our pasuk from the very beginning, that you would eat the Pesach and the matzah and the maror together, sounds like you wouldn't do that even in the time of the temple. And that's why the Gemara now says, Mantana, and this is our last part for now, Mantana deshamat le mitzvot e mivat lo zo et zo. So now that we mentioned that there's an opinion that the mitzvot nullify each other, and someone says they don't nullify each other, so who's the one who holds this? Hillel, it's Hillel. Now this is not the same Hillel as before. This is Hillel, the elder, we'll call him. Tanya, how do we know that it's Hillel who says it? And now this we all know already. Amru halav al Hillel, it was said about Hillel that in the time of the temple, haya korcham bevat echat ve'ochlan. He would put them together and eat them at the same time. Shene'amar al matzot u'merorim yochluhu. As it says in the verse, al matzot u'merorim yochluhu, he took that pasuk literally. You have to eat them all together. And therefore, it must be that he's the one who holds that when you have equal mitzvot, because remember, in the time of the temple, they were equal. They were both obligation of the Torah. Since that's the case, he said we can eat them together because they don't nullify each other. Sounds like anyway, according to the Gemara, that if you held they do nullify each other, then you would have really one of two options. One is to say you wouldn't eat them together. You would eat the Pesach, you would eat the Matzah, you would eat the Maror. It meant yochlu, eat them all the same evening, but not necessarily all together. Or theoretically, you could say, in general, mitzvot or mevatzlot, here there's a special pasuk which tells you, oh, by the way, but here you can eat them together. That's another possible approach. Okay, so now what he says, how does he get that you eat them together? Because it says, al matzot u'merorim yochlu. It sounds like you eat this whole thing all together. Okay, from here we're going to break to chavrutot. And the question, as I said, is going to be, does someone really hold a mitzvot mevatzlot zo et zo? We're now going to breakout rooms, and we will join back together when we're done. I see they're set for 18 minutes.